The Colonial Parkway is one of Virginia's most scenic routes, a winding 23-mile stretch of road that cuts through lush forests, runs along the James and York rivers, and connects the historic sites of Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. During the day, it is a place of calm beauty, sunlight filtering through trees, birds darting across the roadway, and tourists stopping to admire the views. But at night, the same road takes on a far darker quality. There are no streetlights, no businesses, no heavy traffic. The road is lined with thick woods and isolated pull-off areas, making it a place where you can be completely alone and completely vulnerable. For decades, the Parkway was considered relatively safe, a peaceful stretch perfect for couples, families, and history enthusiasts. But beginning in 1986, it would become the backdrop for one of the most terrifying and confounding murder sprees in American history. The story begins in October 1986. On the morning of October 12th, a jogger was running along the Colonial Parkway when he noticed a suspicious car parked in one of the pull-offs. It was a white 1980 Honda Civic, its doors closed and its windows fogged slightly from the cold night air. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but when the jogger got closer, he noticed something chilling. Two bodies were inside. The victims were identified as 27-year-old Kathy Thomas and 21-year-old Rebecca Dowski. Kathy was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and worked as a stockbroker, while Rebecca was a bright student at the College of William and Mary. The two women were close friends, possibly romantically involved, and had been spending the evening together before vanishing into the night. The crime scene shocked investigators. Kathy and Rebecca had both been strangled and their throats had been slashed with a knife. Their bodies were left inside the Honda Civic, and the killer had attempted to set the car on fire, perhaps to destroy evidence. But the fire never fully took hold, likely because of the damp night air. Instead, the vehicle and the victims were left partially scorched but largely intact, offering investigators a gruesome but vital set of clues. The brutality of the murders suggested rage, but the staging of the crime, the attempt to burn the car, suggested calculation. Someone had killed with cold precision and then attempted to cover their tracks. News of the double homicide spread quickly across Williamsburg and York County. The Colonial Parkway was not the kind of place where violent crimes were expected. This was a quiet, almost idyllic stretch of road, frequented by lovers and families, not a dumping ground for murder victims. Residents were horrified. For the LGBTQ community in particular, there was an added layer of fear and unease. At the time, Kathy and Rebecca's close relationship raised questions about whether they had been targeted for who they were. Was this a hate crime, or was the fact that they were two women alone in a secluded area what had made them vulnerable? The FBI quickly took the lead on the case, since the Colonial Parkway is technically federal land. Agents descended on the crime scene, combing the area for evidence. They interviewed Kathy and Rebecca's friends, family, and acquaintances, searching for anyone who might have had a motive. But the case yielded little. There were no signs of robbery, no sexual assault, no clear motive. Whoever killed Kathy and Rebecca seemed to have done so in cold blood and then vanished into the night without leaving behind an obvious trace. For investigators, one of the most unsettling aspects of the crime was the location itself. The Colonial Parkway's secluded pull-offs were known as lovers' lanes, places where couples could park their cars and spend time together, away from prying eyes. To many, it seemed as though the killer had chosen the location deliberately, lying in wait for vulnerable victims. This theory gained traction when agents began to consider whether Kathy and Rebecca's deaths were the work of a stranger who prowled the parkway looking for targets. If true, the Colonial Parkway was no longer a peaceful drive. It was the hunting ground of a predator. In the weeks following the discovery, the FBI received dozens of tips, but none led anywhere solid. Rumors swirled through the community. Some believed a serial killer was on the loose. Others suspected the military, given Kathy's background at the Naval Academy. Still others whispered about jealous lovers or acquaintances who might have borne grudges. But there was no hard evidence to confirm any theory. The crime scene had been compromised by the attempted arson, and forensic science in the mid-1980s was limited compared to today. Without DNA databases or advanced digital tools, the investigation depended on traditional detective work, and there simply weren't enough leads to follow. Yet, even as the investigation stalled, the murder of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski was not forgotten. The brutality of the crime, the innocence of the victims, and the sheer randomness of their deaths haunted the community. People began to avoid the Colonial Parkway at night. Couples who once parked in its secluded pull-offs now thought twice before doing so. Parents warned their children not to drive the road alone. Fear had seeped into the very fabric of the region. What no one knew then, however, was that this was only the beginning. The Colonial Parkway murders were not an isolated tragedy. Over the next 3 years, 3 more double homicides would occur in and around the Parkway, each with disturbing similarities to Kathy and Rebecca's case. It was as though someone, or perhaps more than one person, was stalking young couples in Virginia, striking with terrifying precision and then vanishing without a trace. The Colonial Parkway, once a symbol of history and tranquility, was about to become synonymous with fear. The horror that began with Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski in 1986 did not fade into memory. It multiplied. Over the next 3 years, Virginia would witness a chilling sequence of murders, each echoing the first, each intensifying the sense that something deeply sinister was stalking young couples near the Colonial Parkway. What began as one unsolved double homicide would soon grow into a pattern so disturbing that the phrase, "the Colonial Parkway Murders," became a fixture in newspapers, on the evening news, and in the whispered fears of residents. The second case struck less than a year after the first. On September 20, 1987, David Knobling, 20, and Robin Edwards, 14, were reported missing after a night out. David was a young man just beginning his adult life, steady and responsible, while Robin was still a teenager navigating the turbulence of adolescence. Despite their age difference, the two had spent time together and decided to drive out to Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, an area not far from the Colonial Parkway. Like the parkway itself, Ragged Island was secluded, quiet, and surrounded by water and forest, a place where people could go to escape the watchful eyes of the world. 2 days later, their bodies were washed up along the shore of the James River. Both had been shot in the head at close range. David's truck had been abandoned in the refuge's parking lot, its doors left open, radio still playing faintly when discovered. Investigators immediately recognized the parallels to the Thomas Dowski case. 2 victims, a secluded location, brutality without clear motive. But this time, the method of killing had changed, from strangulation and knife wounds to execution-style gunshots. Was this escalation, or was it an entirely different killer who just happened to target couples in remote areas? The uncertainty only deepened the fear. By 1988, the public's unease had curdled into dread. That April, another pair of young lives was cut short. On April 9, 1988, Cassandra Cassie Haley, 18, and Richard Keith Call, 20, disappeared after attending a college party at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. They were last seen leaving the party around 1:30 a.m., presumably heading home. The next day, Keith's car, a red 1982 Toyota Celica, was found abandoned along the Colonial Parkway, near York River State Park. Inside, investigators discovered both victims' clothing neatly folded in the back seat, but Cassie and Keith were gone. Their bodies were never found. The eerie detail of the folded clothes unnerved both police and the public. Was it a deliberate staging by the killer, meant to confuse investigators, or was it evidence of some ritualistic aspect to the crime? Unlike the earlier cases, the absence of bodies left far fewer physical clues. Without clear cause of death or evidence, detectives were left with almost nothing to go on. Yet the connection to the parkway, the fact that they were a couple, and the abruptness of their disappearance convinced investigators that Cassie and Keith were the third set of victims in what was now looking like a series of connected crimes. Just when the community began to hope the nightmare might end, tragedy struck again. On October 19, 1989, another young couple vanished. This time, the victims were Daniel Lauer, 21, and Anna Maria Phelps, 18. The pair were traveling along Interstate 64 near New Kent County, heading toward Virginia Beach. When they never arrived at their destination, friends and family grew concerned. Days later, Daniel's 1972 Chevy Nova was discovered abandoned at a rest stop near the interstate. Inside the car were scattered personal belongings, but no sign of the couple. Weeks later, hunters stumbled upon their remains in a wooded area close to where the car had been left. Their bodies were badly decomposed, making it difficult to determine exact cause of death, but evidence suggested foul play. Like the others, they had vanished in a moment of vulnerability, alone on a road at night in a secluded setting. By this point, 4 cases involving 8 victims had been linked by geography, circumstance, and haunting similarities. Young couples, isolated locations, abandoned vehicles, violent deaths, and a killer or killers who left almost no forensic trail. The FBI, already involved since the first case, began to publicly consider the possibility that Virginia was dealing with a serial predator. Still, they faced enormous obstacles. Forensics in the late 1980s lacked the sophistication of modern DNA analysis. Crime scenes were often contaminated, and the killer's apparent ability to leave little trace further frustrated investigators. The public, meanwhile, was terrified. The Colonial Parkway, once a picturesque tourist attraction, now carried a reputation of horror. Parents forbade their children from driving there at night. Couples who once thought of wooded pull-offs as romantic spots now saw them as traps. Local newspapers ran story after story about the murders, speculating about connections, motives, and suspects. People whispered about everything from a rogue law enforcement officer abusing his authority to a random thrill killer targeting young lovers. For the families of the victims, the years between 1986 and 1989 were an endless cycle of grief, confusion, and frustration. They wanted answers, but the investigation seemed to move in circles. Each new killing brought a fresh wave of promises from law enforcement that justice was near, yet each case quickly ran cold. The lack of arrests left families feeling abandoned, and their sorrow was compounded by the growing media frenzy, which sometimes sensationalized the crimes while offering little comfort. Perhaps most chilling of all was the sense of escalation. The killer, or killers, seemed to grow bolder, targeting victims more frequently, expanding beyond the parkway itself. The mixture of methods, strangulation, stabbing, gunshot, possible ritualistic elements, raised disturbing questions. Was this truly one killer experimenting with different methods? Or was there more than one predator taking advantage of the parkway's reputation and the widespread fear to mask their crimes? The uncertainty fed paranoia, and by the end of the 1980s, the Colonial Parkway murders had cemented their place as one of the most baffling and terrifying unsolved crime sprees in U.S. history. As the bodies piled up between 1986 and 1989, law enforcement agencies across Virginia were thrust into one of the most complex and frustrating investigations in American criminal history. From the very beginning, the Colonial Parkway murders tested the limits of local police, the Virginia State Police, and even the FBI. who became involved due to the parkway being federal land. What should have been a straightforward homicide investigation quickly turned into a labyrinth of dead ends, missteps, and haunting questions that remain unresolved decades later. At first, investigators treated Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski's 1986 murders as an isolated crime of passion or random act of violence. The crime scene, however, was already puzzling. Their car had been found on the Colonial Parkway, partially hidden in brush, with signs suggesting that the killer had tried to set it on fire. Yet curiously, there was no robbery. The women's wallets and personal belongings were untouched. The brutality of the attack, strangulation and stabbing, suggested rage, but there was no clear suspect. Detectives struggled with basic questions. Was this a hate crime, given that Kathy and Rebecca were romantically involved at a time when same-sex relationships carried stigma? Or was it the work of someone they had crossed paths with that night? By the time David Knobling and Robin Edwards were killed in 1987, law enforcement began to suspect a serial predator. The similarities, two victims, an isolated location, a sudden brutal end, were hard to ignore. Yet the differences in method created confusion. Strangulation in one case, gunshots in another. Were they even dealing with the same killer? The FBI profilers suggested that if the murders were connected, it could be someone experimenting with methods of control and killing, or possibly multiple killers whose crimes were being lumped together because of geography. That uncertainty would shadow the entire investigation. Forensic science in the late 1980s also posed immense challenges. DNA testing was still in its infancy, expensive, and not widely used. Crime scene processing was often limited to fingerprints, hair samples, and ballistics, none of which yielded a breakthrough in these cases. Worse, several of the crime scenes had been inadvertently contaminated. Curious onlookers, local responders, and even weather conditions compromised potential evidence. By the time federal investigators stepped in, much of the critical forensic material was gone. Jurisdictional overlap further complicated the investigation. Because the Colonial Parkway was a federally managed roadway, the FBI had authority, but local and state police were also heavily involved. This led to conflicts over evidence handling, communication gaps, and occasional duplication of effort. Families of the victims often complained that they received conflicting information depending on which agency they spoke to. At times it felt as though the investigation was paralyzed not just by the cunning of the killer, but by bureaucratic red tape. Another challenge was the absence of witnesses. All of the attacks occurred in remote or semi-secluded areas at night. There were no reliable sightings of the killer, no descriptions of vehicles leaving the scene, and no known connections between the victims that could point to a suspect. Unlike many serial crimes where patterns of victimology emerge, the Colonial Parkway victims varied in age, background, and lifestyle. This made profiling difficult. Was the killer targeting couples specifically? Or was the choice of victims opportunistic, driven simply by availability and vulnerability? One theory that haunted investigators was the possibility of a law enforcement impersonator or even a rogue officer. Several families pointed out that their children were raised to trust authority and would not hesitate to pull over or comply if someone with a badge or flashing lights approached. The idea that a killer could be posing as police, or worse, abusing the trust and power of an actual badge, was both terrifying and plausible. FBI profilers did not dismiss the theory, noting that it would explain how the victims were so quickly subdued without signs of a struggle. Yet despite years of speculation, no conclusive evidence ever tied an officer, active or retired, to the murders. As the cases dragged into the late 1980s, frustration mounted. Families accused law enforcement of withholding information, botching the early investigations, and failing to protect the community. Investigators, in turn, insisted that they were working tirelessly, chasing hundreds of tips and ruling out numerous suspects. They interviewed friends, ex-boyfriends, coworkers, and even distant acquaintances of the victims. They investigated potential links to other unsolved murders in Virginia, but nothing stuck. The passage of time only made things worse. Each year that went by meant that witnesses' memories faded, potential suspects moved away or died, and physical evidence deteriorated. By the early 1990s, the Colonial Parkway murders had shifted from an active manhunt to a cold case, unsolved, unsettling, and quietly haunting the investigators who had once devoted themselves to cracking it. For those inside law enforcement, the biggest challenge was not just the killer's elusivity, but the constant weight of failure. Detectives admitted years later that the Colonial Parkway murders kept them awake at night. They knew they had faced a predator, or predators, capable of terrorizing an entire region and walking away untouched. And yet, even with federal resources, modern profiling, and endless media pressure, the case remained stubbornly out of reach. From the moment law enforcement acknowledged that the Colonial Parkway killings might be connected, the public and investigators alike began speculating about who could have committed such calculated and terrifying crimes. Over the years, dozens of theories emerged, some grounded in evidence, others born from fear, imagination, or desperation. What they all shared was a sense of hunting plausibility, and yet none have ever led to an arrest. One of the most persistent theories was that the killer was a law enforcement officer, or at least someone pretending to be one. The idea seemed chillingly plausible. Each set of victims appeared to have been subdued with little sign of resistance. Their cars were found parked neatly, as if they had been ordered to pull over rather than forced off the road. Parents of victims insisted that their children would never willingly stop in such isolated areas unless they felt compelled by authority. Could it have been a police officer abusing his position, or a predator with a stolen badge and flashing lights? FBI profilers gave weight to this possibility, but decades of combing through records of active and retired officers, as well as investigating impersonator reports, failed to reveal a smoking gun. Another suspect theory revolved around a serial killer or drifter who used the Colonial Parkway as a hunting ground. The 1980s were an era when serial killers like Ted Bundy, Henry Lee Lucas, and countless others made headlines across America. Some theorized that the Parkway murders were the work of such a transient predator who targeted young couples at random before moving on. This could explain the lack of consistency in the methods of killing: strangulation, stabbing, and shooting. However, skeptics countered that most serial killers have a distinct pattern or signature, whereas the Colonial Parkway crimes seemed almost deliberately inconsistent. A third, darker theory suggested that the killer was someone the victims knew or even part of their social circles. While none of the four couples were connected directly to each other, some investigators wondered if the perpetrator was someone who frequented the same community spaces, schools, or workplaces. This theory gained traction when tips occasionally surfaced about jealous ex-partners or acquaintances with grudges. But when checked, these leads either lacked supporting evidence or were quickly ruled out. Attention also fell on the possibility of multiple killers. Because of the differences in modus operandi, some victims shot, others strangled or stabbed, certain criminologists argued that more than one person might be responsible. Could it have been two predators working independently but coincidentally operating in the same area and time frame? Or perhaps a copycat scenario with later murders inspired by the earlier ones? The FBI explored this angle but leaned toward the belief that despite variations, the murders bore the imprint of a single controlling offender. There were also more unusual suspects. Some people pointed to military connections, given the proximity of naval bases and military installations in Virginia. Perhaps the killer was a military serviceman, skilled in control and intimidation, who targeted couples during off-duty hours. Others whispered about cult activity, a popular theory in the 1980s amid the so-called satanic panic, yet no credible evidence ever surfaced to support such claims. In 1989, when the last known victims, Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps, disappeared, the case took yet another turn. Their skeletal remains were found in the woods, far from the parkway itself. Some investigators believed this was proof the murders were connected. It was too much of a coincidence for two young people to vanish under such mysterious circumstances. Others felt the differences in location and disposal method meant this final case might not belong to the same series at all. Over the decades, specific individuals have been investigated, sometimes intensely. A few names even circulated publicly: a disgraced former cop, a violent drifter, and several local men with criminal records who fit certain profiles. But each time the evidence was circumstantial or fell apart under scrutiny. The families of the victims often grew frustrated, watching as suspects were paraded in the media only to be quietly dismissed later. Then there are the theories born from absence rather than presence, the gaps in surveillance, the lack of forensic breakthroughs, the strange silences in witness testimony. Some argue that the killer was so methodical and careful that he left virtually nothing behind, a rare quality suggesting military or law enforcement training. Others say the randomness itself is the clue, a predator who killed not out of ritual or compulsion, but simply because he could. Ultimately, the suspects and theories remain just that, unproven possibilities in a case with too few answers. The Colonial Parkway murders sit in that agonizing space where every explanation feels simultaneously possible and inadequate. With no arrests, no confessions, and no definitive suspect identified, the case continues to frustrate law enforcement and haunt the families who, decades later, still wonder who took their loved ones away. For the families of the 8 young victims, the Colonial Parkway murders were not just a mystery splashed across headlines. They were life-shattering events that reshaped every day that followed. The killings robbed them not only of their children, siblings, or partners, but also of any sense of closure. What lingered was a painful cocktail of grief, unanswered questions, and a decades-long struggle for justice. Right from the beginning, many families felt caught between the enormity of the investigation and the inadequacy of communication from law enforcement. They often learned of developments through newspapers or television reports before hearing from the authorities themselves. For parents like Kathleen Thomas's mother and Rebecca Dowski's loved ones, the frustration of silence from investigators was compounded by the bewildering brutality of the crimes. How could young women, so full of promise, be found dead in such a horrifying way, with no explanation, no suspects, and no clear path forward? Over time, this frustration turned into resilience. Families formed bonds with one another, united not only by their shared loss, but also by a growing determination to keep their children's stories alive. Janice and Jack McCall, the parents of Stacy from the Springfield 3 case, had shown the country what relentless advocacy could look like, and the Parkway families took note. Vigils were held on anniversaries. Community events honored the victims' memories. Family members spoke publicly, often with raw emotion, demanding that the FBI and local police never let the case fade into obscurity. For some, advocacy meant throwing themselves into the details of the case. Bill Thomas, the brother of victim Kathleen Thomas, emerged as one of the most vocal and persistent voices. Refusing to let his sister's murder become a forgotten cold case, he has dedicated years to raising awareness, engaging the media, and pressing for investigative transparency. His presence at forums, interviews, and even true crime podcasts has ensured that the Colonial Parkway murders remain part of the public consciousness, even decades later. This family-driven advocacy also exposed the painful reality of cold cases, that answers often come slowly, if at all, despite advances in technology. The families pushed hard for forensic breakthroughs, hoping that DNA evidence or modern investigative techniques could breathe new life into the stalled investigation. When whispers of progress surfaced, rumors of new testing or possible suspects, the families clung to hope, even when official updates proved sparse. The emotional toll, however, cannot be overstated. Parents buried children without explanations. Siblings grew up in the shadow of loss, defined as much by absence as by memory. Each holiday season, each birthday, each milestone reminded them of what was stolen. The grief was made crueler by the knowledge that the killer, or killers, may have lived free, perhaps even walking among them in Virginia's communities, untouched by justice. And yet the fight for justice has never ceased. The families turned their private pain into public advocacy, ensuring that the Colonial Parkway murders were not relegated to the dusty shelves of unsolved crime archives. They demanded accountability not only from investigators, but also from the broader community. After all, these crimes had not only taken lives, but tainted the sense of safety in Virginia, leaving behind an unsettling legacy for everyone who remembered the late 1980s. Today, the case still rests in the hands of the FBI and Virginia authorities. With forensic genealogy offering new avenues of possibility, the families remain cautiously hopeful. They understand that time has a way of eroding memories and evidence, but they also know that persistence has cracked other cold cases wide open. Until that day comes for them, they carry the torch, keeping the names of Kathleen Thomas, Rebecca Dowski, David Knobling, Robin Edwards, Richard Call, Cassandra Haley, Daniel Lauer, and Anna Maria Phelps alive in the fight for truth. In the end, the family's struggle embodies the broader truth of the Colonial Parkway murders, that these were not faceless victims in a forgotten case, but real people with stories, dreams, and futures that were stolen. Their loved ones' refusal to give up is not only a testament to their strength, but also a reminder to the world that justice delayed does not have to mean justice denied. For the families, as long as breath remains in their bodies, the fight for answers continues. The Colonial Parkway murders have transcended their tragic origins to become part of America's haunting catalog of unsolved mysteries. More than 3 decades later, the crimes are remembered not only for their brutality, but for the unsettling void they left behind. The case endures in collective memory precisely because it remains unresolved, a chilling reminder of how even the most intensive investigations can stumble, leaving families and communities without closure. The cultural impact of the murders rippled far beyond Virginia. The Colonial Parkway itself, once considered a scenic, safe, and almost idyllic stretch of road, became synonymous with danger and unease. Residents and tourists alike began to see its tree-lined seclusion in a different light, a place not just of beauty, but of lurking menace. Parents grew more cautious, warning their children about driving at night, stopping in secluded areas, or trusting strangers. In this way, the Parkway murders reshaped local culture, embedding a quiet vigilance into everyday life. Nationally, the case joined the ranks of infamous unsolved mysteries such as the Zodiac Killer, the Black Dahlia, and the Springfield Three. The story has been featured in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books, ensuring that new generations continue to learn about it. For many true crime enthusiasts, the Colonial Parkway murders stand out as one of the most perplexing cases of the late 20th century, particularly because the FBI was involved from the very start, and yet the crimes remain unsolved. That paradox only deepens the fascination. The unresolved nature of the case has also fueled decades of speculation. Amateur sleuths, online communities, and independent researchers pore over the details, drawing connections between victims, suspects, and possible motives. The case lives on in digital forums where theories are debated passionately, from the idea of a serial killer disguised as law enforcement to more elaborate conspiracies involving organized crime or military connections. In an era when cold cases are increasingly cracked by forensic genealogy, the Colonial Parkway murders remain a frustrating outlier, resisting easy answers. The legacy is not only about fear and fascination, however, it is also about resilience and remembrance. Through vigils, advocacy, and storytelling, the families and their supporters have ensured that the victims are not forgotten. Their persistence has become part of the case's cultural footprint, symbolizing the human determination to fight for justice no matter how many years pass. This legacy of advocacy has inspired others facing unsolved crimes, proving that silence does not have to follow tragedy. Yet, despite decades of investigation, technological advances, and waves of renewed interest, the Colonial Parkway murders remain an open wound in America's true crime history. Every retelling, every documentary, every article carries the same question forward. Who killed those 8 young people and why? Until answers are found, the case occupies that liminal space between history and myth, where facts blur with theories and tragedy transforms into legend. The Colonial Parkway murders' unresolved mystery is its most haunting legacy. It is a story that continues to echo in Virginia's forests, in the voices of grieving families, and in the imagination of a society both terrified and enthralled by the idea that some secrets, no matter how deeply we search, may never be revealed.